and welcome to the Casual Historian Podcast. My name is Grant, and this is my co-host, James.
Hello, everyone.
This is the podcast where we talk about all the things we don't usually get to talk about in our history classes. And today is our 10th episode, and our 10th episode special is going to be where we're going to talk about the clash of civilizations. Is this a model for which we can look at world history or contemporary events? And are there any other theses that more accurately describe the world we live in today?
I think that the clash of civilizations is somewhat of a term that gets overblown, especially recently with it being included in political debate. Well, I think that as we look throughout history, we do see civilizations, which can be seen as groupings of collective agreement on culture and simply the way things work. And when they come into contact with others, they sometimes do not agree, and they sometimes clash violently. And we've seen this, from the beginning of recorded history up to now. However, I think that in the more contemporary sense, the notion of a clash of civilizations is problematic because especially it views the clash as revolving around a Judeo-Christian, somewhat Western civilization versus an Islamic civilization, and that they are inherently incompatible and is almost used as a justification for violence between the two of them on either side.
I don't know if you've read Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which is where this whole thesis idea comes from, but the thesis in it is basically that conflicts in the post-Cold War world are going to be along civilizational lines. And he defines there being about 7 or 8 different civilizations in the world today. There is Western civilization, which would be, Western Europe plus the United States and the other British settler colonies like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and sometimes South Africa. You have what he refers to as the Orthodox civilization being Russia and Eastern Europe, parts of the former Byzantine Empire. You then have the Islamic civilization being, Middle East plus North Africa, Central Asia, sometimes Indonesia. Then there is the Indian civilization. Then you have what he refers to as the Confucian or Sinic civilization, China, Korea, and sometimes Southeast Asia. Then you have what we refer to as either a Japanese or a Asia Pacific civilization being, Japan and sometimes Polynesia, which I actually have some explanation for that in a little bit. And then there's the Sub-Saharan African civilization. Now, these are some pretty wide groupings, but I think the idea behind them is that peoples within these groups have more in common with each other than they do with other peoples. And the idea in the Clash of Civilization thesis is that after the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all or most international conflicts are going to be between civilizations rather than there being an intra-civilizational conflict.
I think that contemporary history has actually already borne that out to not be the case. As we look at the rise of violent terrorism in the Middle East, we actually do see that in, for example, the Islamic civilization, as has been mentioned, open conflict, both in the context of Arab Spring, in the context of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS taking aim at other Muslim populations and, say, entities. The ongoing flashpoints between the Turks and the Kurds, both of whom are Sunni Muslim, kind of bears that out. And on the other hand, with the civilizational boundaries as they've been described, there are some that I question. What exactly is the boundary as described between Western civilization and Orthodox civilization? Is Poland included in one or the other? And even then, the ongoing tension between Orthodox Russia and Orthodox Ukraine, and 8 years ago, Orthodox Russia and Orthodox Georgia in the Caucasus. Culturally speaking, I tend to look at Latin America, basically everything but in the Western Hemisphere, but the US and Canada, as having more in common collectively with each other than they do with the United States and Canada. I mean, honestly, almost be tempted to chart a Latin American civilization as one unto itself.
That's something I once thought as well, but after doing a lot more digging into Latin American political, philosophical thought, they actually have a whole lot more in common with Western civilization than they do with anything else, considering the fact that they are derived from members of Western civilization. Most of Latin America, or pretty much all of it, come from Spain, Portugal, and France, 3 parts that are of the Latin languages. They are Latin American, and you find their political writings in Latin America are always citing, a lot of it is French Revolution. A lot of it is where they're getting a lot of their political ideologies from. They get all of their ideas from Western civilization. However, to Anglo-America, Latin America looks very different, but we actually have a lot more in common than it seems on the surface. And I would, in terms of their grouping having more in common with each other than, say, Anglo-America, I think that's more easily explained with subgroupings within civilizations. Like, I would say Western civilization is sort of divided into 4 subgroups. You have the Anglosphere, here being, the English-speaking countries within Western civilization. You would have the Latin American sphere. You would have the Nordic sphere, because there's an area it's of Western, like the Nordic countries you would call Western civilization, but they were not part of the Western Roman Empire. So they're sort of their own little sphere. And then you have the parts of Europe that were once part of the Roman Empire, forming the core of Western civilization.
Sure. And then, of course, there's the weird trying to figure out the boundary between those and the Orthodox world, because, of course, many Eastern European nations, Poland, the Czech Republic, the southwestern Slavs, Slovenians, and Croatians are not Orthodox, but culturally could be seen in that vein. But again, the big question, though, is, about how do these clashes take place? Clashes can take place ideologically and through dialogue, and that has been happening. The post World War II, and especially more so in the post Cold War, there's been a greater move towards the notion that different ideas can be held on equal footing, as opposed to the 19th century European approach, which is that there's a civilizing mission, we are inherently superior, and the ratings of other civilizations are just, degrees of how far away they are from what we think we are.
According to Huntington, when in terms of the borderlands between civilizations, there are countries that serve as, mixes between two. They're the borderlands between different civilizations. Like Poland, Ukraine, these are kind of areas that are sort of part of the borders between Western civilization and Orthodox civilization. Sort of borderlands. Once again, the Eastern Europe is a lot more porous because you get some areas in the Balkans that are a lot more Orthodox than they are Catholic, but you still have a good Catholic chunk in Ukraine. Like all borders in Europe, they get messy.
And then, of course, there's Greece, which the Orthodox is very much more of a Western style country than the contemporary Slavic ones. That was mostly because Greece was exempted from falling into the Soviet sphere during the Cold War.
Yes, and Turkey serves as a border region between Western civilization and the Islamic civilization. You have Japan, which sort of serves as a border between Confucian civilization and an Asian Pacific civilization. It sort of has a foot in both.
Yeah, let's talk more about the Asian Pacific civilization, because when we think about the great island nations of the Pacific, it's usually Japan, which we've already mentioned. New Zealand would fall into the Western group. Indonesia is possibly in the Malaysia, possibly in the Islamic world group. What about the Philippines?
Yeah. So when he refers to the Asia Pacific, sort of tends to an idea of a sort of similarities in cultures between them, especially the pre-colonization cultures of them. Like in Japan, they had this view of their leader as being a god, basically, or at least that was one way, like a god or godlike. This is something similar you found with a lot of Asia Pacific civilizations pre-contact or pre-conquest. Like in Hawaii, they had a lot of the similar ideas where they held the king as a almost divine figure until they were Christianized.
Now, how was that different then from the semi-divine status of the emperors of China?
Well, this is why China falls within the Confucian civilization. Modern Chinese civilization is based largely on Confucianism. And yes, they had this idea of semi-divine emperors, which is why there is a connection between Japan and the Confucian civilization. There is that bond, but it's...
Right. Most people tend to, and I'd actually even say that most historians and anthropologists see stronger links between Japan and China, Korea, than Japan and, say, the scattered archipelagos of the Pacific.
Yes.
Exceptions to that, of course, being parts of Japan, like perhaps Hokkaido, which was the last of the islands to really be developed, and of course, the Okinawa island chain.
Yes, well, I think one of the reasons, if I recall correctly, is that one of the big themes of the Confucian civilization civilization, aside from it being, heavily influenced by Confucian philosophy, is that these were areas that much of them at one point or another have been occupied and controlled by China, which Japan never has. They've had a lot of influence from China, which is why they are a borderland civilization, but they've never been controlled by China. It's mostly been cultural and economic influence between each other.
So obviously then this would include countries like Vietnam, the northern part of which has been controlled at times by previous Chinese dynasties, same for Laos and Cambodia. What about the territories of Thailand then, which has a relationship to China much more like Japan?
The Clash of Civilization thesis, of course, does have some fuzzy areas, but this is general ideas that, Thailand has more in common with, say, China than it does directly with Japan, even culturally, though it is its own unique entity. And I would say Thailand is another border region. Probably you define it as a border region between the Sinic or Confucian civilization and, say, the Indian civilization. There's sort of some bit of an overlap, at least in terms of their influences over it.
Now, how does this thesis discuss the manner of the clash or the clashes?
The bulk of clashes are going to be between these different cultural civilizations, because Samuel P. Huntington bases these civilizations on religious terms. He focuses a lot on religion as being the basis of civilization and culture. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. Basically, you're going to have these different ideas. They're going to eventually clash because of more and more globalization. As these ideas are coming more and more contact with each other, there's going to be more and more abrasion. There's another idea, another book called Jihad versus McWorld, and it's another continuation of this idea that you're getting globalization versus tribalism. Is a big way. At least that explains a lot of the conflict that's happening between Western civilization and, say, the Islamic civilization. You're having these people who are trying to establish this world ethic, this world morality, this world political standards, versus people who are trying to go and keep a more traditional form of society. And that's what you have, this conflict between the West and Islam. But it also explains something of the conflict between the West and, say, the Confucian civilization, where the West has somewhat imposed its standards of a nation state on the rest of the world. And so we're seeing more clashes revolving around this kind of idea, with China trying to reimpose its own idea of what power structures are going to look like. China has a more traditionally tributary style power system where it's dominant and it has subordinates, while in the West we deal with independent nation states on equal footing.
So, however, then the thesis might be flawed in its over-reliance on religion as a major factor, because one thing that has especially eased conflict to an extent has been the growth of secularization in several of these civilizational spheres, I guess one could say, in which dialogue takes place. And disagreement, yes, takes place. But the idea of religious violence at nation-state level is increasingly not merely a thing of the past, but just an alien concept.
It's not the perfect thesis, but I'm finding that for the 21st century, it's proving more right than it is wrong, because we're basically seeing Western civilization clash with basically every other one. We're seeing it clash with China, and especially in the economic sphere. We're seeing it clash with Russia over places like Poland and Ukraine and the Baltics, and where we've always seen the West and Russia clash. And we're seeing them clash with the Middle East again.
Well, actually, let's actually tackle that, because now I have to decide what constitutes a civilization. Does a civilization constitute the government? In which case, yes, the relations between the West and Russia do become kind of muddy, because there's also very strong popular opinion on both sides in support of their respective governments and in opposition to the others. But when we look at, say, the West clashing with Russia, and especially in that very localized area, the duel in a lot of ways between Russia and the EU, we find several of Russia's civilizational partners well within the Eurosphere. You have Romania and Bulgaria, and you have countries like Serbia, which are on the track to join the EU.
And that's actually part of where the conflict is coming from. Russia sees the West intruding on what it considers to be its turf in Eastern Europe. And that's another driving factor in this clash of civilizations. People are intruding into what they see as their own sphere. This is mine. you cannot do anything with this. And that's where a lot of these conflicts are coming from. There's no solitary big bad enemy for the West to combat anymore since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now it's simply a matter of a bunch of peoples around the world who don't see things the way we do. And we're trying to spread our ideas and our views through a multitude of ways. We've tried doing some of it militarily. We've tried doing it some economically, some culturally, but it's still leading to clashes.
Well, then let's also tackle, I touched on this earlier, but civilization within the space of the Islamic world.
Mm-hmm.
As of now, there are no governments no governments with full control of their countries in the Sunni world that are overtly opposed to the West. And the only other major Islamic nation that has a government opposed to the West, nominally at this point, I would say, is Iran. We still have the violence of extreme Islam and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh. So, which is the marker for the civilization? Is it the governments, the largely secular governments, or is it the fundamentalists and the jihadis? I would say it's the governments.
The governments are a large part of it, but then again, these governments formed around these collective identities that people have, these things that form nations. Well, I guess in some circles they refer to as the myths that build nations. And that's what these are formed around. These secular governments, they're still formed around these ideas. And so they're still being based on religion in a large extent, especially certain parts of the world in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, to an extent, but let's also not forget that there are several Middle Eastern governments that would not exist, and their countries would not exist in their form had it not been for the Western Arab imperialism. Examples include the Kingdom of Jordan or the Emirate of Kuwait, who geopolitically had no basis for existing prior to the 20th century. But, I think that we also then tend to see, we see large-scale amounts of collaboration, because I think that while we do see the clashes, I think that really we tend to see more so the clashes that involve the West. Because, as you just broke down the civilizational groups, what we have been seeing in the 21st century is this growth of collaboration and cooperation among several civilizational groupings. You have, for example, what's called the BRICS economies. You have Russia, India, and China, which, are the cores of three of the civilizational groups you described. But that also includes Brazil and South Africa, which are, I would say, are part of the Western civilizational group that you described.
The crash of civilization thesis is a model, it's a general model to look at current and near future and near past events. Like with anything else, you're not going to find a perfect model, but the idea is that it is a pretty reliable model to predict what conflicts or how conflicts are going to look in a way in their sort of geopolitical sense. It's going to be between civilizations. You're not going to see France and Germany going to war again. You're not going to see China invade North Korea. You're not going to see these intra-civilizational conflicts like we have in the past.
So I disagree strongly that we're not seeing intra-civilizational conflict, because we clearly still see it. We see it in the ongoing wars in sub-Saharan Africa, which are definitely intra-civilizational. We see it in the continuing clashes between secular governments in the Middle East versus radical fundamentalists and jihadist extremists. We still see it in conflicts between Russia and some of its orthodox neighbors like Georgia and like Ukraine. We see it in some of the clashes within parts of South America, dealing with the power of drug cartels. And of course, the outstanding antipathy between North and South Korea, and the state of affairs between Taiwan and China. The clashes aren't necessarily just, violent or military exchanges, but, we were still seeing intra-civilizational clashes. And I think that in a lot of ways, the disagreements within civilizations still, to an extent, dominates the course of world affairs much more than the clashes between civilizations.
The clashes within civilizations definitely will always play a much bigger role in the internal politics of members of these civilizations, but I still find the model holds strong despite these things. Like, there's a lot more in the book that I can't really get into that much detail here without it right in front of me, page per page, highlighted. To respond to sub-Saharan Africa, that's sometimes one of the groups he says, sometimes I don't think of it as a civilization in and of itself, mostly because it hasn't had the same kind of historical development as most other places in the world have. There hasn't been this wide-spanning African empire
Well, we have the great civilizations of Western Africa, the Songhai, the Mali empires.
There's never been this, I guess I should say, there's never been this native identity of Africanness until about the 20th century. This native idea. Like the Europeans have thought of themselves as being Europeans before.
Okay, well, let's tackle India then. India also had no common identity of being Indian until the mid 20th century. Before that, it was a checker mark just as much as Europe of different states with vastly different languages, differing religions, at least five separate religions, competing and coexisting in the subcontinent, including not just the modern state of India, but also including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and probably also Myanmar, and possibly even Malaysia. But I think that the clash between civilizations is often seen as pitting entire civilizations against entire civilizations. And I simply don't see that happening. We're not seeing this thing happen where the entirety of the Western world is teaming up in this coalition battle against the entirety of the Islamic world. It's not happening. And I don't think anyone is projects seeing that happen. But we do see our fragments in as much as we still see intra-civilizational conflict now. We see flashpoints where parts of civilizations are going to clash with each other. But we also have to remember that as part of globalization, as part of the internationalist growth that has been taking place, sometimes in a patchworky manner, and sometimes in a lopsided way, I don't see the notion of an entire civilization fighting another to be anything that's going to take place anytime soon.
The thesis isn't saying that you're not going to get an alliance of all the nations of Western civilization together invading another civilization, but it's not. When conflicts do occur, it's going to be between parties of different civilizations. When the major conflicts on the world stage happen, it's going to happen between members of differing civilizations rather than part of one civilization attacking another part of that same civilization. You're not going to get a Franco-Spanish alliance trying to reinvade England.
No, you're not. But we do face down the danger of a possibility that within a few years, violence could be restarted within Northern Ireland. We could see new flashpoints in the Balkans if peace agreements in Bosnia or Kosovo were to break down. And so, I see that the bigger threats, the dangers to world order are less about clashes between the civilizations. Because I think that those civilizations, as we've been handling it, are generally much more based around the nation state level. And I think that in general, diplomacy has been doing a much better job at managing conflicts in that way. And I see that's where progress is being made. The dangers we face are with the non-state entities, terrorist organizations and rogue states. Being the bigger dangers, and those come from many walks of many civilizational backgrounds.
I guess something that needs to be understood with the clash of civilization thesis that Samuel P. Huntington proposed in the early to mid 90s also has to come from what it was a response to. And there's one historian and classicist, Francis Fukuyama, who created a different thesis referred to as sort of the end of history in the last man. He wrote an article in 1989 called The End of History, where he talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union is ending major historical development in terms of man's ability to come up with new ideas that are better. Basically, that he believed that with the development of liberal democracy and capitalism, mankind has basically peaked intellectually, and that we're not going to come up with any ideas that are actually any better than those. And that there might be people who constantly think that there is going to be something better. We're not going to look upon anything else that's going on with fondness. It's a lot more complicated than making it sound, but this is what the Clash of Civilizations thesis was a response to. In that, no, history hasn't ended. We're not done coming up with ideas. And in fact, these conflicts are going to continue in a much more cultural way.
I think that perhaps, coming as, two things on the near the end of the Cold War, we have the benefit of nearly 30 years of development to see, how these theses have worked or have not worked. I think Fukuyama's thesis, honestly, is just the most blatant arrogance. Humans at varying times in history have always thought that they had the defining word on what would constitute culture and civilization, and yet humanity continues to advance. I think that where Huntington's thesis bears some reconsideration and revision, certainly, is less the emphasis on clashes between civilizations, but how the civilizations change and how they shift and how that can create the flashpoint that might be described. Because when we're doing it with the way civilizations change or adapt to a shifting world, that's where we can get more insight into why clashes happen, and also could serve to talk about to integrate the issue of intra-civilizational conflict that threatens everything else.
These were a pair of theses that were definitely products of their time. After, for several generations, the conflict was always, the free world versus the communist world. You don't have this simple dynamic anymore, and people are trying to find some framework to fit world affairs in. And I still think we're still looking for that. We don't know how to frame the world anymore.
Well, I think that we've never really understood. It's very rare, I think, in human history that we've been capable of being able to define the world order we're in a very clear and concise way. But I think going back to another set of theories, which was one that saw basic shifts in the way the world worked. And before World War I, you have a multipolar world. You have several great powers of relatively equal strength. Most of them are monarchies. Most are monarchies. Most are fairly authoritarian. After that, you have the sudden growth and burst of republics. By the end of World War II, the multipolar system is broken down because the old European empires are tired and exhausted, and we then move to the bipolar world, in which you have the tension between the U.S. and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies. And even though there are the non-aligned group, they don't really play a pivotal role in the outcome of the Cold War. After the Cold War, and along the time that these theses would have been developed, we were seeing what was postulated as being a monopolar world, or unipolar. Yeah, unipolar, which would have been, just the U.S. as the sole superpower, which might have been certainly true in the early 90s, but that didn't last long because, we had things like the resurgence of Russia in the early 2000s. You had things like the new growth of a European Union on both an economic and a political level. You've seen, the expansion of China. So now we're seeing, for the first time, a multipolar world. But unlike the pre-World War II multipolar world where all the poles were concentrated pretty much in Europe, this is now a multipolar world that spans the globe. And I think that there's some adjustment. And of course, our own cultural point of origin being within the West, creates a certain, distortion in terms of our ability to view the other civilizations.
Yes, well, we could talk about this for a long time. There's a lot more we could, and we might come back to this topic at some later time. But I think we need to wrap this up. So I'd say thank you, everyone, for listening. You can find this podcast on casualhistorian.com and on iTunes and on our YouTube channel. You can follow Casual Historian on Twitter and Facebook. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, business inquiries, you can send those to casualhistorian@gmail.com. So thanks for listening.